Well, welcome everybody to our Wednesday webinar. I'm Doreen. I work for the Sashbear Foundation, and this is our July webinar as part of our summer webinar series. I just want to welcome you. Thank you very much for taking your time this evening to be with us. We'll be joined by Shendelman, and we'll be introducing him in just a moment. This will be done in a webinar format, so that means that none of you will be actually visible on the screen and you won't be able to talk. However, we do have the chat function, and we also have a question and answer function available. So you're quite welcome to type questions and comments into the chat, and also to type questions into the Q&A section. Whatever time we have left after Alex's presentation, we will attempt to address some of the questions that you have provided for us. So with that, I guess I will just also remind you that the Sashbear Foundation is a registered charity in Canada. One of our main activities is the Family Connections program, which provides skills for people who are supporting a loved one, particularly a loved one who has borderline personality disorder or emotional dysregulation. And the Family Connections program is based on dialectical behavior therapy. And as you know, this population of people who have BPD and emotion dysregulation, they also have a very high risk of suicide attempts and suicide completion. So this is a topic that really touches many of us very closely. So I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Carpenter from our board of directors, who will introduce Alex, who is our guest speaker tonight.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Just a brief history of Alex's program and how he and Sashbear connected. Sashbear founders Mike Menu and Lynn Puri connected in 2011 with Alex to participate in the Survivor Support Program after losing their daughter Sasha to suicide. Since then, both organizations have been in contact and in collaboration. For example, Sashbear was invited to present at one of the Distress Center conferences in 2018. Alex is the program manager for the Traumatic Loss Survivor Support Program at the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto. The Survivors of Suicide Loss Support Program provides a safe place in which survivors of suicide loss can identify, explore, and clarify their thoughts as well as feelings, and begin to navigate the aftermath of suicide loss with peer-to-peer support. Since 2005, Alex has worked with this community of suicide and homicide loss survivors, exploring their stories of fractured lives, rebuilt purposes, and a repaired sense of meaning and trust. Tonight, Alex will discuss the impact of a suicide loss and how survivors can come to terms with that loss and potentially regain hope. Please welcome Alex as our special guest speaker tonight.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the reminder of the connection that I have with the Currys. You know, in a lot of ways, it's such a poignant reminder of what survivorship is all about. And for many survivors, you know, that process of moving forward in your loss, of regaining a sense of purpose and meaning, which clearly has been had by this organization and by the Currys. And in a lot of ways, they represent what I want to talk about tonight, which is regaining and cultivating hope and resilience after you've been exposed to a suicide loss. It might not feel that, at least at the beginning, and certainly in the words of survivors, that it's possible or even likely that you would be able to cultivate a sense of hope or resilience. I know how often I've used that word, that R word, the resilience word in our support program, and you often get a blank stare, at least early on. and how unlikely it is, given how shattered they feel, how broken they feel, coming into our program sometimes just days after their loss. And however, what I see is that people move in that direction. And every time journey is different for every individual that comes to the program, moving towards a sense of hope and resilience. But what I'd like to talk about tonight is what I've learned from survivors, the words of survivors in part, and the trends and patterns that they have expressed as they move towards hope and resilience. I'd like to talk about where they begin early on, where they go, and how they get there. So where do you begin? As a survivor, you've got a call from somebody that somebody that you care for deeply has ended their life by suicide. And where do you begin to put the pieces in some kind of place that you can then start moving forward? Where do you begin? And a lot of it at the beginning is about finding the words, finding the words to articulate that language of vulnerability, that deep sense of brokenness. And it also begins with finding places, finding spaces that you can connect to, that you feel safe enough to express that pain that you're experiencing, that shatteredness that you're experiencing. And as you're moving forward into your loss, what you begin to discover, and a lot of it is about educating yourself as a survivor about how the loss impacts you. And by talking and understanding how the loss impacts you, you begin to get a sense of control and begin to get a sense of movement forward. And how does the loss impact you? First and foremost, it's about understanding the trauma of traumatic loss. In part, it's about recognition of our wounds, and it's about containing the trauma that has impacted us of a violent, unexpected, uncontrolled situation. Survivors understand, they discover that trauma has an incredible body, mind, whole life impact. It's an event that affects everything in your life. It affects how you function. It affects how you interact with others. It affects how you respond to crises that come up, even after the suicide. And it impacts how you respond to triggers that come up. It impacts your emotional reactions. For instance, there might be an increased sense of hypervigilance. It impacts something that is called your basic needs, your sense of safety and trust for yourself and for others. And it also violates your assumptive world. So your basic assumptions in life have been shattered. Your sense of control and predictability about things around you and about the people around you has been forever altered. So once you understand that, then you begin to understand, how do I begin to manage that? Trauma also impacts you physically. We recognize that trauma has an enormous impact on how you sleep, on your high blood pressure, conceivably. We know that survivors of suicide will often experience immune system issues. It'll have a huge bodily impact, the trauma. And there's also incredible psychological and cognitive effects of trauma. It can have a huge impact on your memory, on your executive functioning, on your ability to get things done. And it also impacts something that's called hypo and hyperarousal. So at times we might feel that we're over-aroused, at times we might feel under-aroused. And as a result, it feels that we're not able to accomplish a whole lot. It can also have an impact on how we grieve. Trauma events can sometimes put grief on hold, or it can elevate grief. And because of that, the grief process can sometimes be extended or not start at all right away. It's also important to know that trauma is on a continuum. The impact of trauma can vary from person to person. Everybody identifies themselves, what the trauma is and what the impact of the trauma is. And for some, it can lead to post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress disorder results. And for others, eventually it can lead to something called post-traumatic growth. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later when I talk about the outcomes around trauma that have a more positive feel to them. So if trauma is having that kind of an impact, what's really important, of course, especially at the end of the continuum where you're having intrusive thoughts, where you're having imagery consistently bombarding you, it's really important at that point to know that trauma-specific interventions can be really helpful. Getting help at that point, specifically around trauma, is critically important. Now, this is not about diagnosing from my end, because it's not what we do in our program. But as somebody who's doing intake with survivors, and I'm recognizing or they're telling me about the long-term impact of the trauma, it's important for me to talk to them about getting specific help for the trauma. And that could be in the form of EMDR or somatic experiencing. There's many trauma-specific modalities that can have a huge positive impact on your trauma experience. So the question that I've often asked, and I began to ask myself, especially as I began to think or look at this through the lens of hope and resilience, is how is the recognition and the management of trauma connected to hope and resilience? And I think that's really a critical issue, because early on, it doesn't feel resilient. It doesn't feel like there's a sense of hope. But in a lot of ways, understanding the impact of trauma for a survivor and talking to them about the impact of trauma will help normalize their experience. And if you can have conversations, or if the survivor themselves is able to work on what we would call trauma containment, it comes to be about reasserting a sense of control. If you're either overreacting or avoiding and underreacting to triggers, and as a result, you feel paralyzed, by being able to contain the trauma, to get a sense of control back, you can have a sense that there's a little bit of movement here. There's a little bit of movement forward, and it feels a little more hopeful. The other thing is that as part of trauma, there's a recognition, thankfully, in the literature now, and it's filtered down, of course, that there's a need to seek trust, to seek safety. When we're understanding the impact of trauma, the single most important thing very often is finding those safe places. So when your assumptive world has been violated, when your basic needs have been shattered, part of that adjustment is to regain some of that, to regain a sense of safety, a sense of trust. But what we also know, and I'm not going to get too much into the physiological mechanisms, but we also know that safety in the context of trauma has a huge, enormous positive impact on how the brain deals with trauma. And so we're beginning to understand that as we're trying to get a handle, a sense of control, and a sense of movement out of this fog of trauma, out of the bombardment of images, finding those safe places and that sense of trust is really critical. And it feels more hopeful. Other pieces related to trauma that can be really helpful are if you acknowledge past traumas. It's quite often that a survivor would have experienced other events in their life that were traumatic. And by talking about the current trauma, the suicide loss, it might open up conversations about past trauma that had never been talked about, had been suppressed. And finally, there's an opportunity to have a conversation about lifelong issues that have finally opened up and culminated in these current conversations. And that feels hopeful. One of the words that we hear very often from survivors when I do intakes is this idea of feeling stuck. That's their words, it's not mine. But a lot of that feeling stuck has very often to do with events that haven't been articulated or current events that are being articulated. And so when I talked earlier about finding the words initially and finding a way to articulate what's happening, because so much of it is about trauma, when you're finding those words and acknowledging, you're finally perhaps being able to move away from that sense of being stuck towards something hopeful or more optimistic. The other piece about trauma and the management of trauma that becomes really critical in the sense of hope or resilience that could begin slowly developing is that by dealing with the trauma, and I talked earlier about how trauma can very often suppress grief, but by being able to manage trauma, you might be able to start mourning, you might be able to start grieving. And I know grief and mourning, even though technically they're different, they often become interchanged. But being able to mourn fully, the loss of somebody you cared for so deeply, being able to move into that part of your life where you're talking about grief more openly because trauma has been contained, that too feels hopeful. I'm not saying it's not hard, because it is. Everything around grief can be hard. At the same time, by being able to open these conversations in safe spaces and containing trauma, it feels a little less hard and a little more hopeful. And the last thing is, with regards to trauma, is that we begin to discover ways to manage other crises. We begin to manage ways to manage triggers, to acknowledge triggers and figure out ways of coping with them. And sometimes when our lives feel not quite in control, when we don't have a sense of how we can cope with things, but by containing trauma and figuring out how we can deal with crises and with triggers, it leaves a little more sense of hopefulness that something can be done. And it's a sense of movement rather than feeling stuck. So trauma is getting those words, being able to explore trauma is really critical as an initial piece. The other initial piece, and this is something that we've begun to understand in the last couple of decades around narrative work in suicide loss, is the idea that we become really effective, or need to become effective, at making sense about what happened. And the narrative piece around sense making, where we become, private detectives essentially early on around the suicide, because we don't have the pieces. I mean, we usually don't have complete stories. In fact, if I were to be honest, I don't know one survivor who has ever said to me that they have all the answers. But because we become private detectives, we create a narrative, and it's a crucial early element of dealing with loss. Putting the pieces together of the how and the why and the making sense of it is a crucial early step. It's not something that's set in stone, of course, because that's an evolving story. For most survivors, how we make sense of what happened is something that will probably be with them forever, and that's realistic. What wasn't said in the introduction, that I too have the lived experience of suicide loss, as my sister died by suicide a number of years ago. And And I have to say that to this day, I'm still trying to make sense of some of it. And I'm still asking questions. The difference is that for a lot of survivors, at some point, the narrative, like myself, you get to a point in your narrative where you're okay with what you know. And it doesn't take as much space in your life to try and create that story, that narrative about what happened. And you move away from being a private detective so much to being a survivor and a griever, because you've been able to leave that alone for a short while. And this is so crucial in the context of hope and resilience. We know early on when I said suicide shatters your assumptive world. Everything has been turned upside down. Everything that you thought you knew about the person, you're not really sure now that you really knew. Did they choose to do this? Where does that fit into your narrative? The issue of choice or what is sometimes called volition and suicide loss when somebody dies is a critical element in trying to understand what happened. And so when trying to put the pieces together of what happened with the person, factoring in mental health issues, other social issues, perhaps addiction issues, and many other things that might have fed into or led up to that person's decision to end their life by suicide, we begin to realize that suicide is a perfect storm. And that the only way to see suicide, in fact, is as a perfect storm of things coming together, many things coming together at once in that person's life. And so when trying to struggle with the story, the narrative, the making sense, finally getting to a place and seeing suicide and that person's suicide as a perfect storm becomes a critical step on the journey towards, and I'm going to say, towards recovery. I know recovery is a word that many survivors struggle with, just like hope and resilience and healing. But there is a piece where recovery is happening. It may be an incomplete story, an incomplete journey towards recovery. But recovery as a process, part of that process is putting the story together and seeing suicide as a perfect storm. The other thing about needing to make sense and put the narrative together is that there are some studies that show that not having that narrative, not having that making sense, how do we make sense of this piece, is often linked to other complications later on. It's not unusual in our program for survivors who are struggling with not understanding how this happened. In fact, some of them have said they have no reasons, they have no clue why this happened. It's not unusual for those survivors to be struggling and to have longer term complications in their grief. And so what becomes clear that as a way of moving forward and a way of coming to terms, or what you might call psychological integration of the loss, as a way of coming to terms with the loss, putting those pieces together are really important. The other piece of putting the story together is that it addresses where you as a survivor fit into the narrative. And there are questions, and they always come up about responsibility. And those are very difficult questions. Many survivors encounter them. Many survivors encounter guilt and regret. And it's really important to have a realistic, truthful narrative about what happened, because it helps address those issues. And not addressing those issues can be linked to reduce hope, resilience, and potential recovery from a suicide loss. The other piece, and the last piece that I want to attach to this, is that by having, and it may seem obvious from what I've said, that by having a narrative that you're comfortable with for now, by having that story for now that makes sense, where you can leave it for now, it also allows you to reinvest It allows you to reinvest with other parts of your life, whether it's your working life or your family life or others. It helps you to reinvest because it gives you some space. And those things, those connections, those distractions that work and family provide are really crucial towards our sense of resilience and hope. And our ability to function as a human after a traumatic loss improves when we're able to have that story in a place contained for now. And functioning our routines, we need to start reestablishing routines in order to have a sense of hope. So when talking about hope, and so that's, a little bit about trauma and making sense as two crucial pieces, understanding and managing trauma and creating a narrative that are linked to our sense of recovery and hope and resilience. I want to talk a little bit about grief after suicide loss. About how we integrate what's happened into our lives, how we come to terms with the loss. And I first want to touch on some basic assumptions that we have, that we hear from others. And I know, talking to survivors, and the survivors in the audience, I'm sure, have heard those things from other people that really irritate us and are not really helpful in our healing journey. And some of those assumptions, are really crucial to understand, aren't very true and effective. So some of the things that we hear, for instance, is that grief happens in stages. And, that can be a challenging assumption to hear because it doesn't feel like that's what's happening. And it may feel that we're not successful in grief. I mean, the truth is that grief is a lot more cyclical. It's a lot more dynamic. There's something that we use in our program called the grief loop, but other people refer to it as a roller coaster or waves or tsunamis, whatever you want to call it. The truth is that grief rarely, if ever, happens in stages, because that's not an accurate depiction of how grief plays out in our lives. When we recognize that grief happens cyclically or in a loop or a roller coaster, we realize that when we're having those moments, when we're in the downward part of the loop, we realize that it's okay, because that normalizes, that feels, we know then that there's a process of moving out of that. That is part of the normal grief process. We also hear from others that grief is the same for everyone. I mean, that may be a no-brainer, but it's really clear that that it's not. However, the challenge becomes, because we often have families coming in who are struggling within the family because other people in the family are not grieving quite the same way, and they're not communicating about it. So in part, it's recognizing that grief is completely different for everyone, and that communication about that grief is the critical piece. The openness to other people's experiences. Within a family or within a circle of friends, it's important to recognize that. We often hear about time limits, and this is a social issue very much. We don't get a lot of time off for bereavement now. I don't know, I think it's 3 days or something like that, depending on your relationship. Other aspects of traditions have changed, the grief process in terms of time. A good example in my tradition, the Jewish tradition, where we sit Shiva after a loss, it used to be clear that it would be 1 week. And it's become 3 days now, or 1 day now. And so this idea that there should be time limits on our grief. And then sometimes you need to stop and think about that. If you're anyone, or, let's say you're a parent who's lost a child to suicide, or to any loss. And imagine somebody saying to you that, really, that's about time, and forgetting and not acknowledging how critical and how important that relationship was, that loving relationship that you had, and that it's an unending journey, it's an unending story. But we hear these things, and it impacts how we are, how we feel moving forward. And just two last ones is that time heals. There is an element where it seems like moving forward through time that we start healing, that it's the time, but it's really about active self-care. It's about acquiring new skills, such as how to deal with trauma or how to create a narrative. It's acquiring new skills as we move forward. So it isn't just the time, it's the trend. It's the trend forward, the trend upwards that matters during our journey of grief. And finally, one that we hear is that grief is about saying goodbye. It's about resolution. It's about closure. And again, if you talk to most survivors, that's not something that's part of their vocabulary. The key with loss is it's about integration. It's about carrying the weight, not about putting it down so much. And it's about your continuing bond. So those are some assumptions that people have, but I also want to talk about some helpful grief concepts that help understand our grief and that help us potentially grieve as we move forward. One of the most important concepts that I have found with suicide loss is the idea of that we're dealing with tasks of grieving. We're not talking about a something where we're happening in stages. I'm talking about tasks that are present or not present, or that can come and go. And the tasks of grieving approach, which started quite a while ago with Warden, but was expanded on by others around suicide loss, has become a really effective way to understand our grief after suicide. And so when you look at what some of the tasks are, they make real appealing, intuitive sense. And some of those tasks that they talk about are reducing isolation, absolutely critical. There's a tendency after suicide loss to be alone, to seek aloneness, because it's so painful, and there's a lot of stigma and shame. Other tasks include, finding meaning, healthy mourning behaviors, and re-engaging with life and new social management skills that sometimes have to be learned. So as a group of tasks, and recognizing those tasks are the things that become important for many survivors, if not all. It's helpful as a way of understanding how we could grieve, how we could deal with our grief. Another helpful concept is dual process grieving. I like to think about this as the idea that we sometimes grieve and sometimes we don't grieve. I really like this idea because it speaks to this idea that we often compartmentalize around our grief. And we need to compartmentalize. We need to spend time that's not about grieving because it's so hard. Grief is really hard to do. And when we recognize that we don't always need to be grieving, and sometimes hopefully not feeling guilty, because often there is a lot of guilt about feeling that we're not grieving properly, it's okay to do that because that's a natural process. It's also helpful to think of continuums of grief. Some have talked about instrumental grief, intuitive grief. It's helpful to think of grief styles And this is really useful because then we recognize that people grieve differently. One of the really interesting grief style that I've been exposed to, perhaps more often with homicide than suicide, is the idea of being advocates. And I can think of a lot of suicide loss survivors that have become advocates for change, advocates for change in the mental health process, or the mental health field, or in hospitals. There is real need for change. And part of the grief journey for that person is about being an advocate. Sorry, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are being posed here. So some of these concepts can be helpful. Also, they're helpful because it helps validate, it helps normalize our experience. It helps give permission to what we're experiencing. You know, and a lot of times we don't feel we have permission to grieve in a certain way. And because either of social or cultural norms, the truth is that we do have permission. And all of these fit into what is our way of grieving. So I want to talk a little bit about important themes that come up for survivors and in the grief experience. We talk a little bit about, you know, these are things that are heightened or noticed during loss due to suicide. So in addition to trauma, and I talked a little bit about that sense of responsibility and guilt and regret and developing a narrative around suicide loss, there's other important themes that frequently come up for a survivor. For some, they might feel at elevated risk. We know that as a group, survivors of suicide loss are at higher risk. And it's important to know that. It's important to know that, you know, because it might be contributing to our own experience or to others around us. And this is a piece where I firmly think that survivors need to educate themselves around risk. If other family members, if you have a concern about their level of risk, it's important to be educated around how to respond. And there's a lot of good programs out there around that. Safe Talk and Assist are just two of the basic ones, but there's other ones as well that will help us understand how to respond to somebody who's at risk. This is a real critical issue amongst survivors of suicide loss. Other things that commonly come up are, I talked about choice a little bit. Mental health issues are common, either pre-existing the loss or something that comes up as a complication of the loss. And I noticed a question in the chat about complicated grieving. I'd like to return to that afterwards. But you know, complications of losing somebody to suicide are real, and sometimes they are mental health issues that will come up or feelings of risk that come up. And what I mean by complications is these are things that will impact our recovery and how we're grieving. So if as a result of the suicide loss, we have our own sense of depression, our own anxiety, which could be, or PTSD, those are complications that will impact how we're grieving. And it's not unusual for that to happen. It's also not unusual for past mental health issues and past trauma to resurface or to surface as a result of the suicide loss. And that could also have a complicating effect on how we're grieving. Now, there is a difference in my mind between what I would call complicated grief and grief with complications. And I think for me, and this is just partly a personal thing, but partly it's in the field of suicide research and suicide support, the idea of turning grief after suicide into an illness, which it has been, and it has been the DSM as complicated grieving, after 6 months, certain set of symptoms, which has now been removed. I believe that that's a good thing, because in my view, there is never anything wrong with grief. And the challenge with turning it into a diagnosed situation, in my view, it makes it something that this is a medical and it's a medical issue, and there's something inherently wrong with what's happening. These are reactions that are completely normal after experiencing a suicide loss. That's not to say that you shouldn't be seeking medical attention. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there's a difference in viewing what's happening after a suicide as the normal part of dealing with trauma and grief versus something that's wrong or a medically diagnosable condition. And I think that that's a challenge in the field. So I would like to return to that in part of the conversation later. So other things that are important to think about are, I talked about isolation, feeling or being isolated or isolating yourself because of how we're treated or not treated after a suicide is one of the fundamentally most crucial challenges that survivors face. We know how important trust and safety is in reestablishing a sense of control and a sense of being able to deal with trauma and move forward in your loss. However, at the same time, we also know how difficult it is to stay connected to people who aren't helpful. So part of the challenge becomes, how do we find those sources of support at a time when we need it the most? And so very often it becomes that we seek out support groups, peer support groups, other kinds of support from people we don't know, because the people around us are not being effective or not helping us in the way that we need it. Crucially though, isolating yourself after a suicide loss is not good. And it becomes really important to seek answers for how you're being isolated. And there are brainstorming that you can do around that. It could be, as I said, support, but it could also be online support groups. And of course, with COVID being the way it is, we recognize how hard it is to find effective supports for grief. And that could account for one of the reasons why our program has been so busy in the last few months, because traditional support systems have disappeared at a time when you're dealing with a traumatic loss. So isolating yourself is not good, and finding some ways to stay connected or addressing those issues that are preventing connections amongst the people that you prefer to stay connected to close by. So a lot of these things, is about awareness. It's about recognizing what's happening and that these things are normal occurrences when dealing with a traumatic loss. Questions of responsibility, guilt and regret, perceived intentionality or choice, anxiety, the physical impact, all of those things are things that happen for survivors in the context of a traumatic loss. And awareness is really critical that that is happening and it's normal to happen. And through that awareness, as you become aware of what's going on and you're able to articulate those things, whether it's emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual, any of those things that have been impacted by the loss, or socially, you're able to start dealing with them. It makes it more manageable. And because it becomes more manageable and you have a better sense of control through help seeking, it can then evolve into a sense of hope that you can get through this. So it feels like I'm coming back to this a lot, but it's clear through the journey and through the things we discover that we're able to also discover a sense of hope and resilience. So I noticed that there was a question on vicarious trauma. I don't think we'll have time in this to talk about that because it's a much longer topic that's not really for this forum. But if anybody wants to talk separately about that, I certainly can. So I also want to talk about the impact of suicide loss on the family. And so it does have a significant impact on family. It impacts the roles that we have, role changing. We have different stories and narratives about what happened. We have different styles of grieving, as I mentioned earlier. It impacts how we manage information between each other and also the outside world. You know, are we telling people that it's a suicide, or are we not telling people that it's a suicide? That's one of the big questions that come up. It still comes up quite a bit. Is there a communication breakdown in the family? Have people stop talking to each other, which often does happen. This is a hard thing to deal with. And so it makes complete sense that there's going to be things that you're not going to be talking about. Have you scapegoated somebody in the family? Is somebody being targeted for blame? And that does happen quite a bit. We need to hold somebody accountable very often with suicide. Because we don't have the answers, we need to have answers, and we need to have somebody accountable. And as a result, you know, sometimes that happens in the family. You know, more realistically, you know, as you develop that narrative and recognize how many things factored in, including perhaps the medical system, perhaps the hospitals, you know, perhaps other people in the person's life, or addictions or mental health issues, how many things contributed to what happened, it makes it easier not to scapegoat somebody in the family, and to direct it perhaps at things that will allow your family to stay more cohesive, more talkative together, and more open to conversations around differences in grief. Other things that can happen in the family is that sometimes we'll put the person who died on a pedestal, and by doing that, other people feel that they don't have a voice in their grief. And other things that happen in the family is that we very often change routines and rituals in the family. And thank you for bringing up, you know, the impact on siblings. You know, I just want to tell a very quick story about that. I myself, being a sibling survivor, I've done a lot of reading in this area. And one of the things it does is it does shut down siblings in their grief. It's not unusual for siblings to feel that they need to take care of the parents, and in other ways as well, the idea of how the person who died is treated. So there was a family that I worked with who was clearly putting on the person who died on a pedestal. What they had is that as you entered the home, you had huge photographs of the person who died. And the first thing the other sibling saw moving in there or going in there were those huge pictures. There was no space for him. It's not unusual for siblings to feel they don't have space to grieve, or they don't have a voice. And it's a sense of being disenfranchised. So I want to finally talk about how people cope with loss, with suicide loss. I'm a little bit wary of the time. So I just want to talk a little bit about how people cope with loss and how connected that is to resilience and hope. I mean, this is discovering how we cope with trauma and grief is certainly one of the most crucial things. You know, we've seen so far understanding trauma, you know, creating a narrative or about making sense, discovering the elements of grief that are impacting us, and then finally, how do we cope with those things? And that's sort of the flow of trying to understand how do we adapt. And resilience is all about adapting. And so how we adapt and learn to cope is so crucial. How we have hope and healing and resilience about a moment, sometimes just moments of relief. And learning to address aspects of the loss more readily. So key questions to ask when you're thinking about coping with suicide loss, and that survivors, you know, and again, the experts are the survivors in the room, or the survivors that come to the program. They're the experts. That's who we learn from. So what are the questions and things that they've done when they learn to cope with suicide loss? Well, they ask what worked before. Because sometimes this is so life-changing, we forget that we've always had an ability to deal with crisis before. but we forget. And so sometimes going back to the things that worked before becomes really critical. We learn how to contain the trauma, potentially. We can learn grounding strategies that can help ground us when we're feeling triggered. We learn more about our self-care. Sometimes self-care gets put to the side. We don't deserve to be okay. So we forget that self-care is so crucial in this, how we're sleeping, how we're treating ourselves physically. We need to remember that self-care becomes fundamental in the healing process. How can we distract ourselves? As we're talking about guilt, regrets, perhaps responsibility, all of those questions that are swirling inside our head, in order to compartmentalize, remember that dual process idea of grief and not grief. As we're compartmentalizing, part of that is about distraction. And distractions can be really effective because you can't have those constant thoughts bombarding you all the time. It is really important to discover helpful distractions, whatever they are for you, and that you're safe doing them. It is also good to ask occasionally, when is it a distraction and when is it avoidance? That is a good question to ask because sometimes you do need to talk about it. But distractions are important. Learning and through trial and error, one of the most amazing things, and it's so connected to resilience, is how much experimentation survivors do when it comes to their grief. Learning new ways to cope, discovering that they like to read about grief. There's great books out there. Going online and being part of forums, discovering support groups. You never would have thought you would have done that before, but experimenting in trial and error. Another thing really important that it's really important to adjust your expectations and when you're grieving. The phrase that you hear most, and it's really, it's common wisdom, that was just really critical. One day at a time, one step at a time. It's important to adjust your expectations. It's important to find ways to release because anger is a big part of suicide loss. Find ways to release your anger that are helpful and safe to do it. I love there's a child grief program in Oakville called The Lighthouse, and they have a punching bag, I think, in one of the rooms for the kids. I love the idea of finding release if you need it. It's about building a repertoire, that trial and error, like putting things together piece by piece until you feel, what, I'm doing a little bit better, one day at a time, 1 week at a time. I have those moments, those days, those weeks, and then somebody will say to me, well, I had a week when I didn't actually think about it. Well, something's happening there, and that's great. Relying on spiritual practices if they help you, because spirituality and resilience often go hand in hand. Finding connections to support groups, others, online, in person, giving purpose to your grief. That's the advocacy piece, that's the meaning piece, giving purpose to it. What does this mean for me now and who I am? Who am I, this new person? Become a volunteer. And recognizing that feeling better is a challenge. Just briefly about rituals. Rituals are really important. We've gone away from a lot of rituals in society, but they help us recognize that we're not alone, that there are transitions and marking points for our loss. So memorials and remembrance is such a key to bouncing back. There's a lot of evidence now in an area called restorative retelling about the value of memory building and trauma loss. And it helps shift our perspective away from how the person died to our memories of the person. So anniversaries, birthdays, which are very hard to deal with for most, things that help keep us connected to the person who died, and also places. There's evidence that having a place to go to be connected to the person helps the healing process. Whether it's a bench or a tree or a place where the urn might be, or a grave site, finding a place where you can feel connected if you need to be. So I want to finish, and there's like very little time, just to talk about correlates of resilience and outputs from resilience, just as a way of closing. So what I've tried to show here is that the things that you do as a survivor are highly correlated with your sense of hope and increased resilience. So the narratives, your awareness of how it impacts you, your educating yourself, your establishment of safety and relationships, repairing your assumptive world after loss, meaning making, which, because loss like this is very often what you call an existential dilemma. You know, who am I now? What is this now? Like, how do I define myself? Self-care, spirituality, remembering activities, and helping others, all of them are contributors to increased resilience and hope for survivors. And so all of these things that are happening are connected to hope and resilience. And we hear that in survivors. They will say things like, I need to hope, or I hope. And so you hear it, that it's happening. And finally, and crucially, what are the outputs of resilience? What happens because we feel more resilient after a suicide loss? Well, one of the things that's being looked at now is the area of post-traumatic growth. It's such a beautiful, evolving area of research that looks at how, because of what we've been through, our perspective changes. We take on new roles, new responsibilities, we have elevated compassion. All of those things happen because resilience has been evolving in our life. People often ask me why I do this work and how I can do this work. And my answer is relatively simple. It's because the people that I've encountered along the way, the survivors, those who have been shattered at first by, and it's a love story that they want to tell about their loss, and being a place where they can tell that love story, and hearing their words and seeing their journey of hope and resilience. And the other piece is seeing how many of them transition to new roles. Many of them have come back to volunteer. Those are remarkable, beautiful, resilient, hopeful people. And that's why I do this work. But it is a story of hope and resilience. So that's the end for this. And I don't know if there are questions that I should be looking at this point.
Hi, Alex. My goodness, thank you so very much. My mind is swirling with thoughts and questions myself. The one question that I think people would really like you to address is where one spouse has committed suicide, has died by suicide, and the surviving parent then has the responsibility of talking to the children about what's happened.
That's, I mean, I didn't address that. How to talk to children about suicide is very complicated. And there's many factors that need to be considered. One is the age of the child, of course. And we know that there are developmental considerations when it comes to how grief is understood and how loss is understood. And the other thing is that you want to be careful about traumatizing or re-traumatizing somebody who's already experienced a loss, and to add other layers onto that could be re-traumatizing. So you want to be careful about that. The other piece is that it's filtered through this idea that exists around truth telling, and it's a very challenging concept, because the question that needs to be asked is, how much do you need to tell in order for it to be truth? And I think that that's an evolving story. Because I think that what we see with children is very often that you tell something that is in essence truthful, but not the whole truth. But it's enough at this point for that child. And so at some point it's asking the question, if it's enough right now, do we need to go any further right now? Or can we wait until they're more readily able to handle the full truth about what happened? there is a lot of inherent wisdom to the idea of telling the truth, in part because very often people will discover the truth. And hearing the truth from somebody you trust is really crucial. And not hearing it from somebody you trust can lead to all additional complications later on in that relationship. So there's a lot of issues. And my sense is that I think it's really helpful to get support around that process. There's some really good books out there around how to talk to kids around suicide loss, and I would highly recommend them. I can send those titles. One place, the Dougie Center in the US, puts out a book around how to talk about suicide. They also have a book about how to talk about murder. And there's another book put out by another program in Barrie called Season Center for Grieving Children. And they put out a book called What is Suicide Anyways? And that's a really helpful book around how to talk to kids. So my suggestion is that if you're not sure, there are people that can help that process and some good written stuff around it. And to think about age considerations and re-traumatizing considerations and truth considerations. That would be my response to that. Does that make sense?
It does to me. Hopefully it addresses the concerns that the person who asked the question has. I know from looking down the list of names, I recognize some of them, and I know there are people who have dealt with suicide loss, and I'm sure that they have found a lot of meaning in your words. When I want to wrap up in the interest of time, but I just feel like I need to say, when you started and you're talking about these huge impacts of trauma, which many of us have heard, and the first thing I'm thinking is, well, how does anybody survive this, right? Like, it sounds so incredibly shattering, as you said, devastating. And I really feel like, as you have walked us through the process, that as you understand it, that has helped me see that there is so much help available for people who are dealing with these situations, and to be able to put the pieces back together and move on with their lives. So I love the phrase that you used. It's a love story that people are wanting to tell about the person that they've lost, and about the loss that they are experiencing. That's absolutely beautiful. So for everyone listening, I want to remind you again that Alex works at the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto. And so they have these programs that are available, and I expect, Alex, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I expect if people are not in the GTA, that you also have access to other resources that you can recommend.
Well, also because we're doing Zoom and online support right now as well, and so please connect if you need to. I just quickly want to say something, if I can, if there's
Absolutely.
a minute, about the questions about why is the rate of suicide so high in the military. Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting question. And I just did a short talk for the Military Family Resource Center, and I learned a lot there about why it is so much higher. And what I learned particularly is about how, first of all, it's the exposure to trauma and violence, for one thing, and secondary trauma and a lot of other things that are happening for being in the military. Secondly, we're also recognizing that your social network, your support circle, is very often the people that you serve with, and then when you're home and those no longer exist, you feel a lot more isolated. And so those are two of the things that contribute to a higher level of risk very often. And a sense of stigma and isolation, there's a lot of sense of a personality very often amongst people who serve, that that you can't show vulnerability, you can't articulate when you're not doing well. And so there's a lot of factors that come together, I think, for those who serve, that have increased the risk for military personnel.
All right. Oh, Kathleen has pointed out there was one other question we haven't addressed. I think you skirted it a little bit. How do you deal with the guilt that you feel as a survivor?
Yeah, that's almost a conversation in itself. Dealing with guilt is, there's a multi-channel avenue pathway forward. Some of which is, first of all, acknowledging and getting validation for those feelings, which often doesn't happen. A lot of times it's very common for people to say, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. And so, unfortunately, when we hear that, we don't feel that we can give voice to our feelings of regret and guilt. And so they end up still, circling, and we don't give voice to it. So that's one thing. So that validation is really crucial. The other thing is that, in part, there are logical aspects to guilt that can be explored. And there's some really good workbooks around that look at how to view guilt from the lens of a cognitive perspective. There's one called, it's an emotion workbook. I can't remember the title right now, but it gives some really good exercises on guilt. And so that's from a more cognitive, logical point of view. The challenge is that guilt very often isn't just about logic, that it's an emotional journey. And part of that emotional journey is coming to terms with that we're not able to control the situation, and you were not the person, that you identified yourself as completely. And so, a lot of it that you go through an adapting process, sometimes when you're faced with guilt, it stems from this idea that you were the one responsible for keeping the person alive. You were the one responsible for their care, and somehow you failed as a person. And so part of that journey is recognizing that you can be connected to their well-being, but to not all of their actions. And so at the end of the day, recognizing that there's so much that's not in your control, and yet you thought there was. And then the other piece about this is something that's called, within coping, there's a piece in coping that's called, it's a lot like a script situation where you create a response to what might be a statement that's facing you. So the statement is, I feel that I could have done this, this, and this. The internal script, the internal response is but, however, and. And so part of it is recognizing that within the narrative and the perfect storm of suicide loss, that there are so many other complicating factors that ended up contributing to that person's suicide, and just revisiting that in a context of care and safety and without judgment, and so, being able to put out there that you have those thoughts, but slowly being able to have those counter arguments take hold over time. The other thing is, and I'm just going to put this out there, and this is sometimes the conversation that I have, is that I find that we really struggle with the idea of having regrets. And so I've shifted the conversation from the idea of guilt and responsibility, because that's not a fair conversation, to the idea of regrets that we hold. And when you think about regrets on the surface, what are they? They're a statement that you wish you would have done something differently. You wish you would have acted differently, which on the surface makes a lot of sense. And you have those because you really care about the person. So this is a person that you cared for deeply, who ended up dying suddenly, violently, unexpectedly. And you say to yourself, you know what, I wish I would have done things differently. And, realistically, I find that to be an okay statement to say. Part of it is acknowledging your own humanity and your own limitations, and saying, you know what, I wish I would have done more because I really love them. So part of it is articulating that our regrets are connected to how much we cared about them. And they're also connected to what we couldn't control, and so I find regrets to be, and there's a lot of work done now around regrets and how they contribute to personal growth for people. And they do, because very often, because we carry regrets, we start treating people differently, we start acting differently. And as a result, we're able to come to terms with those regrets. So I think that regrets are helpful in times. I think regrets are reasonable to have. And I think the concern would be is when they start edging over into profound guilt or sense of responsibility. And so that's different for me. And at that point, you really do need to put in place some of those cognitive things that can really be helpful around guilt and regret. So those are my thoughts. I mean, it is way more complex than that, and it's a longer conversation. But those are part of the kernels that I've discovered over time, and what some of the research shows us about guilt. Those are some of the things that I've discovered. I hope that was helpful. But if anybody wants to have a longer conversation about that, I'm more than open to it.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much again. Clearly, this is absolutely a huge and profound topic, and we could keep going all evening. But once again, I'll just remind people that I think one of the things that we've learned tonight is that there are resources out there to help us through this. We don't need to go through this experience alone, and in fact, it's not helpful to go through it alone. It's actually healthier to reach out and get help from other people. So thank you again so very much, Alex. This presentation has been recorded, and so once we clean up the ums and ahs that I've inserted here and there, we'll post it on our website.
Too, no doubt. Yeah.
So we'll have it posted on the Sashbear website, and if there are any particular titles that you think might be really helpful, or if there's a resource link on your website, maybe we can add that as well to the information of the recording when we post it on our website. So thank you again very much, Alex.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, good night, everybody.